In this lecture, we're going to learn when not to use the Vue API to develop a component. That might sound strange. Vue provides a flexible, yet powerful API for developing applications. For the most part, it seems like it can help us in every turn. There are times where doing things the Vue way will not always be the best route to go. Sometimes it's much simpler to use the DOM API. I've encountered a few developers who have this problem and feel uncomfortable doing things out of the ordinary. By the end of this lecture, I hope to show you how and when to do things in plain JavaScript instead of relying on Vue. First things first, you'll need to download the zip file containing the starter files in the resource section of this lecture. Unzip the files and install its dependencies. Pause the video if you need to. The application I've provided will be for opening a modal. In the browser, the app will render a button. If we were to click the button, a modal would appear. We can click on the close button at the top right corner to close the modal. Let's look at the code to understand better what's going on underneath. In the editor, I have it pointed to the project. Most of the files are from the default preset. The main changes are in the app and modal component files. In the app component, we have the button element with a click event listener. If the button is clicked, a data property called open is set to true. We're using this property to toggle the visibility of the modal. If we look in the components options, we'll see that it's initially set to false. Hence the modal will be hidden. We have the modal component registered in the app component. In the template, we're using it. The open property is bound to the component. It'll be used to toggle the visibility of the modal. Furthermore, we're listening to an event emitted by the component called hide. If this event is emitted, we'll set the open data property to false. This will inevitably hide the component. Let's check out what's inside the modal component. Two things are happening in the template. Firstly, the div tag with the class modal has its style attribute in a bind. We're checking if the show prop is true. If it is, we'll set the display property to block. Otherwise, it'll be set to none. Secondly, the close button in the modal is listening for the click event. The event listener will run a function called close. In the script block, we can see that the close function emits the hide event. I want to note that we're using Bootstrap styles to help us with the CSS. Bootstrap comes with its own functionality for toggling the modal. We don't have to create a solution ourselves. For demonstration purposes, we'll learn how to open and close the modal without using Bootstrap's JavaScript plugin. The solution we have works fine, but let's extend the behavior. Let's allow the user to close the modal with the escape button. I'm going to minimize some of the code in the template because we won't need to see everything for this project. On the div tag with the class modal dialog, we'll listen for the keydown event with the escape modifier. The escape modifier is a shortcut for telling Vue to run the expression if the key pressed was the escape key. In the event listener, we'll run the close method. Let's try testing the app in the browser. Pressing the escape key will result in nothing happening. This is because key events can only be captured on focusable elements like inputs. The modal is unable to listen for the key down event properly. There's a quick fix we can use. Back in the editor, we'll add an attribute to the element called tab index. Its value will be 0. The tab index attribute can be used to tell the browser the element is focusable. This attribute will allow us to listen for key events on the element. Switch back to the browser to test the modal again. We're able to close the modal by pressing the escape key. However, there are two noticeable problems with this approach. Firstly, we have to click on the modal before we can close it with the escape key. The browser will not automatically focus on the modal. Secondly, there's an outline around the element when it is focused. Outlines are added by the browser when an element is in focus. We'll want to fix both problems. Back in the editor, we'll deal with the focus issue first. We can force the browser to focus on an element. We'll need to access the DOM API if we want to do so. We'll add a ref to the modal dialog element. We'll call it modal. We'll want to focus the element when the modal appears. Luckily, we have the show prop we can watch, which will determine whether the modal is visible. In the components options, we'll add the watch object. We'll watch the show prop where we'll accept the new value argument. In the function, we'll check if the new value argument is true. We want to make sure the element is visible before focusing on it. It's important to check the value before doing so. Inside the conditional block, if the modal is visible, we'll call the focus function on the modal ref. This function will put focus on the element. Let's fix the second issue. We can fix this issue with CSS. Add the style block to the component. We'll select the modal dialog element. We'll set the outline property to 0 to remove the outline. Let's try testing the application once more. The outline is gone, but the modal doesn't close after pressing the escape key. This is happening because the document hasn't been updated yet. We're focusing on the element before the browser can even toggle the element. We can fix this by waiting for the next tick. Back in the editor, we're going to update the watcher. We'll call a function called this.nextTick. It'll accept a callback function. The nextTick function will run when the document in the browser is updated. This function will allow us to wait for the modal to be visible. We'll then be able to focus on it. We'll move the focus call inside the callback function. Let's try testing the modal again. We've successfully closed the modal with the escape key. However, we encountered a lot of issues along the way. We had to create ref, add some styles, and wait for the document to render the modal. It feels convoluted just to be able to close the modal with one key. We're doing things the Vue way, but Vue is supposed to make our lives easier, not harder. There's another approach we can take, which is much more elegant and simpler. We're using Vue's event system to listen for when the escape key is pressed. Instead of using Vue's system, let's switch to using the browser's event system. Here's what we'll do. We'll listen for the key event on the document instead of on the component. This way, we don't have to worry about focusing on an element regardless of if it's visible or not. Let me show you how this will work. Back in the editor, we're going to add the created_lifecycle function to the component. We want to listen for the key event as early as possible. In the function, we'll listen for the key down event by using the document.addEventListener function. We can use this function for listening to events in vanilla JavaScript. It might seem weird because Vue has its own event system, but bear with me here. The second argument is a callback function. We'll pass in a function called this.handler. We'll define the handler function in the methods object. In the function, we'll use a conditional statement to check if the key pressed was the escape key. We can do so by accessing the event.code property. We'll check if it's equal to escape. On top of checking the code, we'll check if the show prop is true. We don't want to close the modal if it's not visible to begin with. Lastly, if both conditions are true, we'll call the close function. We're almost done. We want to make sure to remove the event listener if the component is destroyed. Add the lifecycle function to the component. Inside it, we'll call the document.removeEventListener function with the same arguments as before. This solution works just as well. We can remove the washer completely. The styles can be removed as well. Lastly, in the template, we can remove the event listener, tab index, and ref from the modal dialog element. Let's try testing things out. We're able to close the modal without a problem. The second solution is much easier to implement. We didn't have to focus on the element, nor did we have to worry about adding styles. This behavior was possible by using the browser's event system. It doesn't feel like we're using Vue, but this is a perfectly acceptable solution. In fact, we're still within the bounds of Vue because the code we've written doesn't affect the other components. It's still encapsulated in the component. It's completely reusable, and we can drop it into any object. The parent component isn't aware that the modal component is listening for an event on the document. It doesn't need to know. There are times where using the browser API instead of Vue's API is the better solution. The one thing to keep in mind is always to make sure the code you've written doesn't externally affect other components. This can make it challenging to scale or reuse the component. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one.